Welcome and good morning, everyone. I am Katie Cartman, the Director of Religious Education here at Emerson Unitarian Universalist Church in Houston, Texas. Our beloved community of faith, reason, and affection welcomes all to grow in mind and spirit as together we build a better world. If you are joining us for the first time this morning, we extend a special welcome to you and invite you to fill out our visitor card, which, if you're online, should be a link in the YouTube. If you're in the pews, should be a yellow card, so you can receive more information about Emerson and our activities. Again, welcome to all. We are a church in many places, some of us here at the pews, and some joining us on YouTube from home or wherever we might be in the world. And our world is a different one than it was in early 2020. Our worship service has changed accordingly. We're giving people choices in the pews as to distance between families and whether or not they would like to continue masking. We've put a few offering baskets at the front and back of the sanctuary for people to drop off their offering throughout the service, rather than passing the plates. For those of us in the sanctuary this morning, let's take a moment to picture the dozens of friends, neighbors, and those we've not met yet who are taking part in this service on YouTube either right now or later in the week as their schedules allow. And for those of you who are here this morning and on Thursday you think, oh, what was that the preacher said on Sunday? You can go back and look on Thursday. It'll still be there. Quick reminder to silence your cell phones so that no one's disrupted by a ring or a bing of your favorite puzzle app. Yeah, sorry, that was me, wasn't it? Following the worship service, folks in the pews may head out to the gathering place for snacks and beverages, or perhaps head out to the courtyard and playground to chat. And we'll also have social time on Zoom, hosted by Emersonian Marilyn Rambo. A chance for you to gather in smaller groups to discuss the service and what's going on in your lives. And now for our prelude. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, wherever you find yourself on your life's journey, whichever your pronouns, whether you've walked in or rolled in or dialed in, whomever you love, you are welcome here. Our guest preacher today is the Reverend Dr. Lynn Ungar, joining us on Zoom. Reverend Lynn is a UU minister and a poet whose work has been shared widely, including her poem Pandemic, which went viral all the way back in March of 2020. She is also one of the moderators of the popular UU Hysterical Society Facebook group. She lives in Vancouver, Washington, with her 3 Australian shepherd dogs. Lynn?
I'd like to invite you into worship with this poem that I wrote entitled The Mad Poet's Love Song. I live profligately, dispense big words for free, buy books for a single phrase, and then return like some odd fish again and again to the source. I am promiscuous. I leave books in my bed, fall asleep clutching stories I've only just met. They wake me later, but never remember my name. Mad women love this way, and thieves, giving everything for style, for the flash in the mind, the pull at the gut, risking everything. Old loves, old views, for the day's perfect word, a phrase that caresses. Don't mock me. There is a strange fidelity in falling asleep to the chatter of the printed page and waking to the morning paper. No? Try filling your mouth with rhymes and spitting them slowly like watermelon seeds across the lawn. Then come back and tell me I'm wrong. Come, let us worship together.
Let us rise in body or spirit as we sing together our opening hymn, Ours Be the Poems of All Tongues.
Our story this morning is Mr. Emerson's Cook by Judith Byron Shackner. The day Annie Burns arrived in the port of Boston from County Fermanagh, Ireland, she set about finding herself a job. Annie scoured the newspapers for work. Positions for maids and scrubwomen were plentiful, but it was a peculiar request that caught her eye. Annie was a good cook, so she decided to apply. Wanted, the ad said. Extraordinary cook needed in the town of Concord, Massachusetts. Acclaimed poet and philosopher has stopped eating due to an overactive imagination and meddlesome Mother Nature. Desperate. Send all inquiries to Mrs. Ralph Walter Emerson, Cambridge Turnpike, Concord, Massachusetts. There wasn't much food to cook in my town of Belcoo, Annie wrote to Mrs. Emerson, but I had a talent for making what little there was taste good. Annie soon received a reply from Mrs. Emerson and took the next coach to the country town of Concord. When she arrived at the Emersons' home, Annie walked around to the back of a large white house, passing a lovely garden of pinks. She tiptoed around a sleeping dog and shuffled through a small flock of chickens sporting tiny boots on their scratching feet. And what manner of humanity might I be cooking for today? She asked the chickens. Annie straightened her shawl and stood at the open door. 3 children chased 2 kittens around the room, while a lady in gray was teaching a parrot to say, "Pretty." "Come in," said the lady. "I'm Mrs. Emerson." "And I am Annie Burns, Mum." "Ah, yes, the Irish cook who does so much with so little," said Mrs. Emerson. She looked pleased. "Papa doesn't eat any more," shouted the little boy. "Now, now," said Mrs. Emerson to her son. "It's not that Papa doesn't eat, it's that he doesn't eat enough to suit me." "My husband is concerned with the feeding of his soul," Mrs. Emerson told Annie, "and I'm concerned with the feeding of all 6 feet of him." Annie nodded her head, pretending to understand. "That's why I advertised for an extraordinary cook," said Mrs. Emerson. "It shall take one to win the appetite of such a man." "Well, Mum," Annie said, looking down at her feet, "I think I'm a very good cook who's extraordinarily stubborn. If that'll do, then I'd like the job." "It'll do just fine," said Mrs. Emerson. "Now come with me." She led Annie into the study, where a gentleman sat at a round table in the middle of the room. In front of him, a book lay open where the ink of newly penned words was drying. "Poems fly from my husband's hand like blackbirds from the trees," said Mrs. Emerson. A moment later, Mrs. Emerson was called away by the children, so Annie stepped closer to the philosopher's desk. "Is it true you don't eat, sir?" asked Annie. "Once I had a dream," said Mr. Emerson. "An angel offered me the world in the size and shape of an apple. 'This must thou eat,' said the angel, and I ate the world." "The last time I ate an apple, sir," said Annie, "'twasn't merely an apple." "I admire answers to which no answers can be made," said Mr. Emerson, getting back to his work. That evening, Annie wrote a letter home. "Saints be praised, Mother! I'm Mr. Emerson's new cook. He's said to be a famous philosopher and poet and very wise, but to me he seems 2 cents short of a nickel. What I'll be cooking for this man is a mystery. Angels offer him apples, he says, but will he accept a potato from an Irish Annie? Mrs. Emerson thinks me quite confident, but in the dark corner of my little room I tremble at the thought of cooking for a man who thinks so much and eats so little. Love, Annie." The next morning, Annie dressed quickly and rushed down to the kitchen. She made Mr. Emerson's favorite breakfast of pie and hot coffee. Then she carried it to the garden where the philosopher was watching a brilliant sunrise. "Are you doing some thinking, sir?" asked Annie. "Why, yes," said Mr. Emerson. "I've been thinking that the sky is the daily bread of the eyes." Annie looked up and saw nothing resembling a loaf of bread. She placed the tray of food next to the philosopher and walked back to the house, shaking her head. When she came to collect the dishes, the pie and coffee had been left untouched. "So," thought Annie, "he prefers the sky to my pie, does he now? And to the dog and the chickens," she said. "We shall see about that." The next day, as Annie hung dish towels out to dry, she saw Mr. Emerson and his children walking to the woods. He recited the names of every flower and bird they met along the way, and she heard him teaching the children new words in Latin and Greek as he led them to where the lichen grew thick upon the trees. And he thought them the luckiest children on the earth to have the world as their classroom and their papa for a teacher. That evening, Annie placed a large roast, wreathed in vegetables, at the head of the table. At the other end sat a bowl brimming with buttery potatoes. Mr. Emerson came into the dining room and took his seat. He nibbled on a celery stick and took a bite of a biscuit. Then he pushed his plate away. "Think me not unkind and rude," he said to his family, "that I walk alone in grove and glen. I go to the god of the wood to fetch his word to men." As he crossed the room, he couldn't help but see the discouraged look on his cook's face, and he said, "The reward of a thing well done is to have done it, Annie." "Yes, sir, but the reward of a well-cooked meal is to have someone eat it," she declared. Mr. Emerson just walked out into his yard and gazed up at the stars. "What angels invented these splendid ornaments?" he asked. But no one had an answer. Annie wrote to her mother of all the goings-on at the Emersons and of her troubles. "Lord knows I try to understand Mr. Emerson, but his wisdom escapes me. When offered a warm bowl of soup, he chooses the warm colors of the sunset every time. He told me, 'There's wonder enough in my thumbnail already.' I wonder why I liked mine. I do admire his ability to find happiness in simple pleasures, but then why won't he eat what I make? Mrs. Emerson has not released me from service yet, but I have sorely failed in my task. So please, Mother, if you have good advice, send it soon. I wish only to succeed as Mr. Emerson's cook." Winter brought snow to the roads and rooftops of Concord. Mr. Emerson found monsters and white rabbits in the boughs of the balsam firs. He saw a mastodon in the mighty elms. But no matter how hard Annie tried to see these things, she could not. "Live by our imaginations" was one of Mr. Emerson's sayings. But Annie did not understand these words. She felt as if her own imagination was frozen solid, without the hope of a summer day to melt it. The next day, Annie received a package. She tore the wrapper away from a ragged little book with a note attached. It read, "Dearest Annie, it pains me to think of you having problems with Mr. Emerson's appetite. He sounds like a decent man who should warm to your fine cooking in due time. I was cleaning behind the cupboard this morning when I came upon the cookbook you made as a wee child. Remember the recipes for mud pies and mooncakes, Annie? They're all there, just as you wrote them. I don't know how, but it might help with your predicament. Be a good girl and say your prayers. Mother. Annie couldn't imagine what her mother was thinking of, so she put the book aside until bedtime. That night, a chilly wind rattled the windows of Annie's room. She shivered as she crawled beneath her quilts and began to read by the light of the icy moon. A cup full of clouds, 3 spoons of gray sky, the song of a lark, 1 stone smooth and dry. Though it was the coldest of nights, Annie grew warm. The more she read, the hotter she became, until Annie felt as if the sun itself bore down upon her head. She threw off her quilts and opened the window. As she drew in a cold breath, Annie remembered another of Mr. Emerson's sayings. Imagination is to flow, not to freeze. At that moment, Annie understood what he was saying. She looked up and saw the stars truly for the first time. She held her little book next to her heart and let her imagination flow. Annie imagined a broccoli forest alight with yellow melting butterflies as she looked out the window toward the woods. Beside it was a steaming pond of soup. The sight was so beautiful that Mr. Emerson's friend Henry Thoreau built a cabin by the pond right in the middle of dinner. That night, Annie slept warmly by the open window. Her imagination continued to flow right into her delicious dreams. The next morning, Annie woke before dawn. She smoothed her starched white apron over her dress and carried her little book down into the kitchen. If we are to live by our imagination, she said, then we must cook with it. Annie opened the book to her recipe for sunrise pie. She placed a large bowl beside an open window and watched as it filled with all the colors of the morning sky. The wind blew in bird song and sunbeams, while the earth lent its sweetness to the golden apples and cinnamon spice Annie added. She poured the confection into a tender crust and tucked the pie into a hot oven. Before long, Mr. Emerson appeared in the kitchen. "What heavenly ambrosia wakes me from my sleep?" he asked. "Good morning to you, sir," said Annie, "and have yourself a wee taste of the morning sun." With Mr. Emerson's first bite, a dazzling light filled his head. "I am the sun," he said, and climbed on top of his chair. "I expand and live in the warm day like corn and melon," he cried. Annie cried too, but they were tears of joy, for she had succeeded in winning Mr. Emerson's appetite. Mrs. Emerson came into the kitchen, but she couldn't believe the sight of her husband eating Annie's pie. The children squealed and scrambled around their father's legs, shouting, "We want to be the sun too!" So Annie fed them all her glorious pie and watched as their faces smiled brighter than the sun in the sky. As the family enjoyed their breakfast together, Annie stepped outside. Snowflakes began to fall and her skirts lifted as she twirled in the wind. Annie felt full of happiness. After 2 more helpings of Annie's pie, Mr. Emerson retired to his study, where he spent the day writing. Before dinner, he found Annie peeling potatoes at the kitchen sink. He handed her a piece of paper and walked back into his room. Annie dried her hands on her apron and carefully unfolded the note. Then she read Mr. Emerson's words. "What lies behind us and what lies before us are small matters compared to what lies within us."
Okay, y'all, who's considering pie for breakfast tomorrow morning? I didn't know that was an option. Giving out of what is our own is a transformative act. As a community of faith, we collect an offering not for ourselves or for our congregation, but to give to others as a collective action of our community and as a way to live out our shared values. Please give with a generous heart to support our March Share the Plate recipient, the Rutherford B.H. Yates Museum. Their mission is to promote preservation, education, archaeology, and research of African diaspora history, focusing on the period of enslavement and post-slavery in Houston's Freedmen's Town, the Gulf Coast region of Texas, and their connections to other regions in this world. A representative from the museum board is here this morning. You'll hear more from them at the end of this worship service. And the remaining 25% of our offering goes to our ongoing commitment to Interfaith Ministries Meals on Wheels, feeding Houston seniors. We have 3 ways to give. You can go to our webpage for online giving, you can put your offering in our baskets, or mail a check to the church, and children will be leaving for classes in just a moment.
Please find a comfortable place to be in your seats and place your feet flat on the floor, if you can and if you will, so that you might feel grounded, more connected to the earth, which nourishes and sustains us all. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable, and take a deep breath in as together we enter into a time of meditation followed by silence. Let us enter into the silence together. Amen, and blessed be.
This poem, How to Be a Poet, from Wendell Berry. Make a place to sit down. Sit down. Be quiet. You must depend upon affection, reading, knowledge, skill, more of each than you have, inspiration, work, growing older, patience. For patience joins time to eternity. Any readers who like your poems doubt their judgment. Breathe with unconditional breath the unconditioned air. Shun electric wire. Communicate slowly. Live a three-dimensional life. Stay away from screens. Stay away from anything that obscures the place it is in. There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. Accept what comes from silence. Make the best you can of it. Of the little words that come out of the silence, like prayers prayed back to the one who prays. Make a poem that does not disturb the silence from which it came. I'm delighted to be with you this morning to share some thoughts as someone who is deeply committed to the practices of both writing poetry and being a Unitarian Universalist. I'm not sure when I started writing poetry, maybe when I was around 10 or 11. I also have no idea why I started writing poetry. I suppose, like the infamous mountain, because it was there. If, of course, you can describe an unwritten poem as being there. Something wanted to be written, so I wrote it. My earliest attempts at theology were, I suppose, much the same. I do recall that when I was perhaps in junior high school, coming home from a commencement ceremony for Starr King School for the Ministry, our UU seminary that was then in Berkeley, that I would graduate from many years later, coming back from that commencement and writing down a little thesis on the nature of good and evil. As I recall, all good was attributed to Santa Claus, while all evil was the handiwork of his alter ego, Anti-Claus. Now, by virtue of said seminary education, I can identify that theological standpoint as a kind of idiosyncratic Manichaeism. I could not, however, tell you either what inspired the thought or what drove me to write it down. For me, religion and poetry are just there, part of the underpinnings of life. I'm not sure that in my younger days I ever tried to define, let alone describe, why either one should matter, let alone what one might have to do with the other. But I could tell you that at some point in my life, I came to realize that every poem I wrote was, by some understanding, a religious poem, and that the impulse that pushed me toward ministry from my teens was not unrelated to the impulse that pushed me toward poetry from a bit younger. Which makes sense because when I did really get down to thinking about it, I realized that religion and poetry are essentially the same thing. Or more precisely, religion and poetry do the same thing. Like a blender and a food processor, they might not look alike, but the function is the same. Blenders and food processors pulverize. Religion and poetry connect little things to big things. Religion and poetry connect little things to big things. Religion is about all of the stuff that is too big to know in any absolute way. Love and death and evil and good and meaning and ultimate reality. Religion is about the things that are beyond words, and the words we use to approach those greater realities. What is the kingdom of heaven? Well, whatever it is, it's beyond definition. But in trying to answer the question, Jesus speaks of it in terms of the tiniest, most mundane things. It is like a mustard seed, quite literally a tiny thing which grows into a branching bush that the birds can nest in. It is like yeast, which a woman hides in flour, and the yeast leavens the whole 3 measures. We begin to know what we can't know by way of the ordinary things which we do know, right? Poetry does the same thing. It takes the most mundane, particular things around us and attaches them somehow to the things that our hearts know, but our minds are not able to articulate. Let me offer you an example. A poem I wrote entitled Mozart and Manner. You don't expect to find such a thing on a common Chicago sidewalk. A mobile hump of tortoise casually navigating the cracked concrete. Of course, I know how the absurd breaks in, shuffling the deck of our expectations. God is, if anything, perversely creative, a practical joker of the first degree, but still, a tortoise is a tortoise, odd enough in its own reptilian context, without wandering city streets in that determined tiptoe amble, pretending that one could just as easily be at home in this world anywhere at all, even the corner of Mozart and Manor. It's a tiny story, and for what it's worth, a true one. I was walking in the neighborhood where I lived many years ago in Chicago, and I saw a tortoise walking down the sidewalk. What makes it poetry, rather than just an oddity to mention at dinner, is the poem's temerity in suggesting that we might all just possibly be tortoises, awkward and out of place and entirely welcome and at home in this odd location called life. The little thing bumps up against the big one. Actually, metaphor, which is to say poetry, does something a bit more extraordinary than bumping little things against big things. Metaphor claims that something actually is something else. As you may recall from some long ago English class, a simile asserts that something is like something else. My love is like a red, red rose. That's simile. But the heart of poetry and the heart of religion is not simile, but metaphor. Something is not merely like another thing, it is that other thing. Now, you and I are certainly not tortoises, and yet the poem hints we are. Metaphor, poetry, religion insist that we are not merely similar to the things around us, we are in some impossible way one and the same thing. One of the pleasures of a seminary education at Starr King School for the Ministry, when I was a student there well over 30 years ago, was the opportunity to be in deep conversation with Bob Kimball, who was then the president of the school. There were some interesting challenges to these conversations, as it was notoriously difficult to make heads or tails of what it was that Bob meant when he was talking. But the challenge I remember most particularly was that Bob refused to allow the use of the word about. You could say whatever you liked in these conversations, just not using the word about. Religion, he said, dove into the heart of things, whereas the word about circled the edges. About, he claimed, was a distancing word, and so we did not talk about any subject. We engaged it, or analyzed it, or worried it with our metaphorical teeth. Although it made for some awkward sentence construction at the time, I understand now what Bob meant. Religion is metaphor, not simile. We are not like the rest of the world, we are the rest of the world. Blenders and food processors pulverize, making multiple substances into one homogeneous mass. Poetry and religion leave the components intact, but layer them in such a way that each becomes translucent, whole and yet permeable, visible and yet allowing the other elements to show through. Like those pictures of the systems of the human body printed on transparent film. We are our bones, but look, we're also our veins. See, we're our organs, but at the same time, we're also our nerves. The central truth of religion is the paradox of metaphor. It is absolutely true that each of us, human or tortoise, is a little thing, distinct and particular, with our own smooth or bumpy skin, our own deliberate or striding walk. We are individuals, each beautiful in our own peculiar way. That is the first principle of Unitarian Universalism, the inherent worth and dignity of every being. However, it is equally and paradoxically true that we are all one unified big thing. Call it spirit or life or the universe or God. Throughout time, mystics of all traditions have sung and danced and meditated and prayed and fasted in order to touch that elusive experience of unity with all creation, the sacred truth that we are all one. Rumi, the 12th century Sufi poet, says, "You're sitting here with us, but you're also out walking in a field at dawn. You are yourself the animal we hunt when you come with us on the hunt. You're in your body like a plant is solid in the ground, yet you're wind. You're the diver's clothes lying empty on the beach. You're the fish. In the ocean are many bright strands and many dark strands, like veins that are seen when a wing is lifted up. Your hidden self is blood in those veins that are lute strings that make ocean music, not the sad edge of surf, but the sound of no shore. Well, that's a very, very mixed metaphor, but it does come down to this. We are our particular selves, but we are also the unity of all that is, the ocean that has no shore. That is Unitarian Universalism's seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence. We are the tiny things, the clothes on the beach, the fish in the sea. We are also inside and beyond any particular thing, awash in the great ocean of life. Metaphor is the only way that we can say these contradictory things and have them both be true. Here's how I put it in a poem entitled Boundaries. The universe does not revolve around you. The stars and planets spinning through the ballroom of space dance with one another quite outside of your small life. You cannot hold gravity or seasons. Even air and water inevitably evade your grasp. Why not then let go? You could move through time like a shark through water, neither restless nor ceasing, absorbed in and absorbing the native element. Why pretend you can do otherwise? The world comes in at every pore, mixes in your blood before breath releases you into the world again. Did you think the fragile boundary of your skin could build a wall? Listen. Every atom is humming its particular pitch. Of course you are a symphony. Whose tune do you think the planets are singing as they dance? Your life is a tiny, insignificant thing. Your song is the song of the spheres. Of course, it isn't possible. It's just true. But religion is not just words, it's action. However, it's a particular kind of action. It's action in which we hold the pieces together up to the light, so that the big things shine through the little things, and the little through the big. In a wedding ceremony, we hold the particulars of a relationship between two people up so that the grand concept of love can shine through. And in the wedding, we see love through the faces of those individuals. When you take a moment to learn the name of a visitor to your church, hospitality and welcome are held in your gaze. When you show up for a march or a vigil or a rally, what you do, walk down a street or chant or stand around, becomes a religious act because justice walks with you. In religion, in poetry, the big things and the little things slip inside one another and become impossibly the same thing. The hymn puts it this way: the lone wild bird in lofty flight is still with thee, nor leaves thy sight. And I am thine, I rest in thee. Great Spirit, come and rest in me. Metaphors be with you. Blessed be, and amen.
Please rise in body or spirit. Oh, there we go. As we sing our closing hymn, number 15, The Lone Wild Bird. May the wings of the holy carry you as you go on your way, and may your life provide a nest where the holy can settle and sing. Please be seated. We have some announcements. Social time will be here and on Zoom. And today the lunch bunch is meeting at Chipotle on San Felipe. And we also have a special guest with us, Mr. Al Henson from the Rutherford B.H. Yates Museum, also known as Freedmen's Town Museum, is here to speak a bit more. Come on up. Yeah, come on up. The mic is hot.
Mic is hot. Hello, everyone, today. How's everyone doing? All right. I love it. So she mentioned that I'm Al Henson from Rutherford B.H. Yates Museum, also known as Yates Museum, also known as Freedmen's Town Museums. But Meg has come to stand by my side, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Meg Bowler. I'm a board member of Yates, and delighted to be here to offer our thanks to you, and also to let you know a little bit about the offering that you're giving for us.
Thank you. And I must say that we talked earlier and she said she'd never been in a Unitarian church before. And I said, I feel like I have. And it came to me in the middle of the service because I was a student of architecture, Unity Temple by Frank Lloyd Wright. Then I started looking around and I said, I have been in a Unitarian church. Unity Temple. Frank Lloyd Wright was the architect, so I love the architecture here. We love the service so much as well. But as we speak about architecture, what we do is we preserve houses. Now, the houses that we preserve, the first one was the house of Rutherford B.H. Yates. And that's why it was initially called Yates Museum. But since then, the organization has been trying to raise more money to buy more properties in the areas that were houses of freedmen slaves. Now, this is of a historical perspective because we're trying to preserve some historical housing. So it's Freedmen's Town Museum. So like Meg said, we thank you for your donations for last year because they have helped us because we're actually trying to open one of the sites, which would be our second site. That would be the Yates Museum. And this one will be one of the barbershops, which is also part of I always want to say Nicholson's, but Nixon Museum. So they're right on an adjacent property. So it's moving, but we have more houses, and we're really trying to preserve more houses. So we look forward to any further donations that you may be able to offer us.
Yeah. And also, we want to thank those of you in the congregation here who have assisted in the renovation of the houses. You've given your money, but also your time and your talents, and we really appreciate that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now for our postlude.
To look for joy.